Next to jobs and economic growth, there are few issues, if any, that are more important to Ohioans than the topic of education. From raising standards to workforce development to making up those snow days, there are a lot of issues facing us at the State House these days. State Senator Peggy Lehner is the chair of the Senate Education Committee. She joins us to talk about all of these issues and more in today's caucus conversation. Senator Lehner, thanks so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here, John.
So we have said that our number one priority at the Senate is jobs, economic growth. And a major part of attracting jobs and economic development is having a well-educated workforce. Talk about the importance of education.
Absolutely. There's no way you can separate a quality education from a quality workforce. We have to prepare our students for the high-tech jobs of today and tomorrow, but we still have to prepare them for those things that have been around for a long time, our service-oriented jobs. There are skills that students are only going to learn in school that they're going to need to be successful in the workplace. And
unfortunately, though, the numbers that we are seeing these days tell us that that's just not the case. In fact, there's a report that was out from the Board of Regents. 40% of all public high school students attending an Ohio public college or university had to take some remedial math or English. What's the problem? What do we need to be doing? You know,
there are enough numbers that we could throw around all day, but I'd like to talk about one that I think is particularly important. There was a report that came out under the signature of 100 retired admirals, generals in our military recently that cited the fact that 75% of our kids between the ages of 18 and 24 are ineligible to serve in the U.S. military. Now, some of that is because they have prison records, some of it's because they're physically unfit, but over 50% of them cannot pass the basic academic standards required to serve in the military. Now, that's very, very concerning, because the military has always been a place where people went to get their leg up, to get their first job, to learn some skills, and yet 50% of our kids can't get into the military. So that should be a wake-up call for all of us, that we need major reforms in our education system. Part of the problem is that, the military's changed. The requirements to work in the military have changed. They need those other skills in the other careers and other, in the workforce in general. So the changes in the military are not isolated to the military.
Well, you're right. Things are just becoming much more complex and complicated. Whether it's, the one company that recently just announced from China that's coming into your district, the Chinese company that's going to well, windshield manufacturing.
500 new jobs.
Right, and it's not just, cutting a piece of glass. It's a lot more technical than that.
Exactly.
So we have to start this somewhere. Obviously, the typical place to do that is in K-12, but even earlier, I know early childhood education is a big push of yours.
Right. Well, if we look at who's successful in high school, who graduates from high school and goes on to college, or rather, if we look at who's unsuccessful, we can trace those same people back to the third grade, where we can show that they didn't know how to read, and they were socially promoted, went on without knowing how to read. But what makes a successful third grade reader? Go back to kindergarten. We can tell the day a child enters kindergarten if they're likely to pass the third grade reading guarantee. Many children, over 40% of our children, come into kindergarten 2 to 3 years behind, not only in the cognitive skills, but in the non-cognitive skills. Their ability to sit still in a classroom, to follow directions. Those sort of things are just as important as knowing their ABCs or their last name or how to count to 10. All of which they don't know.
So the third grade reading guarantee, you mentioned that. That's been kind of a little bit of a hot button
Sure.
as a number of things in education are right now. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because frankly, that shows that people really care about how we're doing, with our kids.
Yeah.
But talk about the third grade reading guarantee, what that really means, and what options there are for kids who are struggling readers.
Okay. The third grade reading guarantee is probably the most important piece of policy we've passed in the last several years. And basically what it says is we're through socially promoting kids just because they've now finished third grade, they're 9 years old, it's time to go on to fourth grade. If they don't know how to read, we're going to hold them back. But the retention isn't the important part about the third grade reading guarantee. It's everything that builds up to it. Since that was passed, across the state, you see schools putting in pre-K programs. You see schools of education teaching their teachers how to teach reading for the first time. That's very surprising to a lot of people. But we are seeing substantive changes from the pre-K, well, actually even back to birth. I mean, people are looking at what's going on at birth, right on through to teacher prep, all brought about because of this important policy change. So schools are putting in summer programs to help prevent the summer slide. They're putting in after-school reading programs. They're bringing in members of the community to mentor and to read to kindergartners, first graders, second graders. They're collecting books that kids can take home and have in their hands for the very first time. So it's an exciting time, and I think we're going to see a lot of kids held back this year. We're expecting that, and the public needs to expect that. But next year we're going to see fewer, and the year after that, fewer and fewer. And more importantly, down the road, we're going to see fewer kids dropping out of high school. We have a 25% dropout rate. In some places it's 35%. We've got to put an end to that.
Well, part of this is all about adopting more rigorous standards.
Right.
And there are a number of different names you can call that. Ohio basically calls it the new learning standards.
Right.
How do you see this implementation taking place in Ohio over the next few years, whether it's third grade reading guarantee or some of the new assessments that we're doing to test high school graduates?
Well, one of the things that we've observed in the last 10, 15 years really is that American students are falling farther and further behind on some of the international tests.
The latest one has us dropping to, I think it's 26th in math.
26th in math.
We're behind Vietnam, Slovakia, and Estonia. That's just three of the countries. And
we like to think of ourselves number one. We're not even in the top 10.
Below average, pretty much in everything.
Right. And one of the things that we're seeing is American students seem to be scoring particularly low on problem-solving type skills on these tests. We consider ourselves a nation of innovators, and we're losing that. So the new learning standards that have been put in place are taking kids out of just learning things by rote and answering questions, multiple choice questions, and they're putting a lot more emphasis on teaching things deeper, to teach children analytical skills that will help them solve problems, critical thinking skills. These are things that we just have sort of let slide in our curriculum, and we're changing that. So the new learning standards are going into place. This is the first year that all schools are actually teaching to them. Some of them got a couple years head start, and they've been doing it for a couple years, but this is the first year, and next year will be the first year that we're going to actually have tests completely aligned to these new standards.
And that's called PARC,
That's
correct?
called PARC.
That is the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for
Right.
College Careers. I had to write that one down. Why do we need this new assessment? I mean, you kind of mentioned it, but is it to match up with the higher standards?
Right. The questions on the tests are going to be problem-solving tests. They're not going to be traditionally, for example, with a math question. You know, you've given 4 answers, multiple choice question. Students are going to be asked instead to solve a problem and show how they're solving it. They're going to have to show every step along the way and how they got to their answer. Obviously, this is going to be more expensive to grade, and you know that's a consideration, but it's one of those things that we have to make a priority.
Well, what other benefits are there to these tests versus what kids take now?
Well, they give us a much better sense of where each individual student is, where their skills are, where their strengths and weaknesses are. So teachers need to be sort of retrained to understand the data and then make use of that data, so that they're teaching to individual students in their classroom rather than, you know, teaching exactly the same thing to all 25, 30 students.
So it's a lot more individualized.
A lot more individualized. It also will help principals understand where some of the weaknesses in teachers may be. You know, they may notice that this teacher over here is really, really good at teaching problem-solving skills of a certain kind, but they're not so great on perhaps comprehension and reading skills or something. So they can work with those teachers on an individual basis the same way those teachers are working with students.
So the students benefit, teachers benefit
Right,
too,
right.
really. We all hopefully
all
will benefit. Before we go, we had a really rough winter. So, you know, it's the one thing everybody's talking about
Right.
is, you know, all these calamity days, you know, how are we going to get to make up these days? You've been pretty heavily involved in this from the beginning. Can you give us an update on where things stand?
The legislature, both the House and the Senate, are getting close to agreeing on giving 4 additional days, free days. The current version that the Senate is supporting is one that says they have to make sure that they've made up those 5 contingency days before they take the 4. And I think we're going to end up with some variation of those 2 proposals.
Very good.
I hope.
Well, Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
Well,
Really
thank
appreciate
you, John.
it. And thank
Glad to
you
be
for
here.
joining us. As always, you can keep up to date with us every day on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Ohio Senate GOP, or visit our website, ohiosenate.gov/Republicans. Thanks for watching.